Battery full. Connected.
Okay, Chuck, so I'm going to go ahead and start. Okay?
Okay.
All right, and you've got the mute button, and I'll remember to unmute myself. Okay, good morning, all. My name is Tim Jeffcoat. I'm the district director with the Small Business Administration here in Houston. If you are not in the Houston area or in Southeast Texas, then you should refer back to the district office in your area to give you some specific support as you have questions or issues with PPP loan. Those of you on this call, you should have already received your payroll protection program loan, or should be in the process of receiving one, have an application in with an area bank, or you're in the process of getting an application to an area bank. If you aren't one of those people, then this webinar may not be the best use of your time. If you are a banker and you want to learn about forgiveness, this is not the webinar for you. You have a webinar at 1:30 every day this week out of my office that, among other things, talks about forgiveness. With that said, let me go ahead and get started. So what we're going to go over is the guidance that SBA has issued about forgiveness of your payroll protection program loan. This guidance is not meant to answer every single possible question that there could be, every possible scenario. Instead, this this guidance is meant to give an outline of how to achieve forgiveness, and a lot of those variables you'll be deciding on your own or with input from your advisor. We hope that we can make you smile. If you're not doing it now, please go ahead and do it. Now, first we'll go over a few basic things related to forgiveness that will be very important for you to know. This is probably the most important slide in the entire slide deck. Everything that we are showing you is coming from an official government document. Most importantly is the one that's in yellow there, the official guidance. This was issued back on April 2nd, the day before PPP loan applications were able to be accepted by area banks. In addition to that is a fact sheet for borrowers that we will refer to. What we call the FAQs. So this is a growing list that grows over time of mostly these are frequently asked questions by lenders on how they administer the program. The CARES Act itself, there is a specific guidance on how the banks are to disperse the money. And then there's a supplemental guidance that was issued April 20th that amplifies on that first document. So that might look confusing to you. Don't be confused. What we've done here is we've for you the pertinent pieces of all of these that can help you as you go through PPP loan. So one of the things that's discussed quite often here is full-time equivalence. Very important thing for you to note that for purposes of loan forgiveness, the CARES Act uses the standard of full-time equivalent employee, not full-time employee. To determine the extent to which the loan forgiveness amount will be reduced in the event of workforce reduction. So you want to worry about full-time equivalence. You know, the most fundamental aspect of this, give me just a second here, please. The most fundamental aspect of forgiveness is that the calculations you made to get your PPP loan, if you do that, then your loan should be forgiven. So whatever you said you were going to spend on payroll, then spend that on payroll. And whatever you said you would spend on non-payroll, which would be mortgage interest, rent, or utilities, then spend that appropriate amount. And then your loan should be forgiven. It should be that easy. So let's talk about what payroll costs are. There's lots of questions about what's a payroll cost. You can read this screen as well as I, but I'll run over it. It's compensation to employees first and foremost. Lots of questions about what is compensation to employees. Basically, it's anything that will be taxed. And it may be something that aren't taxed. But for an example, let's say you have salespeople and you pay them all an extra $300 a month for them to compensate them for using their vehicle. Well, that's compensation. What if you pay people a stipend each month for their housing costs, or their bus costs for getting to work? That's compensation. So whatever compensation is, then payment for vacations, parental, family, medical, or sick leave, allowance for separation or dismissal, payment for the provision of employee benefits, such as insurance premiums, their retirement benefits if you have any, state and local taxes that are assessed on compensation of employees, and if you're an independent contractor or a small proprietor, then we're most likely going to be looking at your net earnings. Now, all of this should be just reviewed, everybody. This should be really straightforward stuff for you because you've already pursued a PPP loan. Now, when you calculated your PPP loan, when you applied, you should have gone through these basic 5 steps. You should have aggregated payroll costs for the last 12 months for those employees whose principal place of residence is the United States. If you have employees that are not in the United States, they're not included. Subtract compensation paid to employees greater than $100,000 a year. Calculate average monthly payroll costs. So it's going to be that total of all of your payroll divided by 12. Then you will have multiplied that by 2.5 to get your loan amount. And those 4 steps is what everybody should have done, or something very similar to that. There's a step 5 if you got an economic injury disaster loan. And we're not going to go into detail on that one here since that's probably not most of you on the call. So when does the 8-week period start? Get this question quite a lot as well. We are requiring that the lender makes a one-time full disbursement of the PPP loan within 10 calendar days of the loan being approved. That's approved by the SBA. So that's when they get done approving you at the bank, they turn around to an SBA computer system, type in a few key things, and then back to the loan number. When we assign that loan number, that's when the clock starts. Now, if you got an SBA loan number prior to these things, and this will be a very small section of you, then it's for the 10 calendar day period. That begins on April 28th. Now, note these last 2 bullets. These should be very important to you. Lenders are not responsible for delays in dispersing the money if it's due to the borrower's failure to provide required loan documentation, including a signed promissory note. And if funds have not been dispersed because the borrower hasn't submitted that documentation, then within 20 calendar days, we're asking them to cancel the loan. So if you have been approved for a loan and it has the SBA approval and you haven't finished the promissory note or other documents that your lender is asking for, you need to get that done or they will cancel the loan. Now let's get into the details on what it takes for a loan to be forgiven. I didn't mention this earlier, but if you see at the top of this slide, it says section 3220 and also some other sections. That's referring to the specific sections in the guidance where you can find this guidance. So can my PPP loan be forgiven in whole or in part? Yes, it can. And the amount of forgiveness is up to the full principal amount and any accrued interest. The actual amount depends on the total amount of payroll costs, payments of interest on mortgage obligations incurred before February 15, 2020, and then that same date, February 15, 2020, applies for rent payments on leases that were dated before that date, utility payments that were under service agreements before that date. And this is evaluated in that 8-week period that I described earlier, 8 weeks following the disbursement of the loan. Not more than 25% of the loan forgiveness amount can be attributed to non-payroll costs. And as we say here, non-payroll costs are only payments of interest on mortgage, rent payments, and utility payments. So what we can do is let's look at that a different way. From the fact sheet for borrowers, it says it a different way. It says it kind of the backwards way. How much of my loan will be forgiven? You will owe money when your loan is due if you use the loan amount for anything other than payroll costs, mortgage interest, rent, and utilities over the 8 weeks after getting the loan. And not more than 25% of the forgiven amount may be for non-payroll costs. I have already heard stories of folks that have gotten PPP loans and have already started buying equipment, doing all kinds of things with it that is not allowed. They will have problems going forward, so don't do that. You will also owe money if you do not maintain your staff and payroll. So these bullets are very important. Number of staff. Your loan forgiveness will be reduced if you decrease headcount. So if on average you have 10 FTEs, now remember those are full-time equivalents. On average, if you have 10 FTEs, and after the 8-week period you say you have 5 FTEs, then you're going to get a substantial reduction in your forgiveness. Now remember what I said earlier, the most important, the simplest way to look at this is the calculations that you used when you applied for the loan. Go do that during the 8 weeks and you should be able to achieve forgiveness. So if you said you were your calculation going in said you had 10 employees, then you need to have 10 employees in the 8 weeks following. If it said you were going to spend $100,000 on payroll, then in the 8 weeks following, you need to spend $100,000 on payroll, as long as that is at least 75% total expenditures. Now the second one, level of payroll. Your loan forgiveness will also be reduced if you decrease salaries and wages by more than 25% for any employee that made less than $100,000 annualized in 2019. So that does say you can reduce salaries by as much as 25%. But if it exceeds that, then you're going to get a reduction in your forgiveness. Rehiring. If you had to lay off, you have until June 30, 2020 to restore your full-time employment, FTE, and salary level for any changes made between February 15, 2020 and April 26, 2020. So if you had to, say this a different way, if you had to lay off between February 15, 2020 and April 26, 2020, you have until June 30 to get that head count back up. Now you see the references on the left. All three of these on this forgiveness slide are from different guidances, but they all complement each other. And they are a bit redundant. Let's go over them because I know it's very important to you. So the first one is from the official guidance. Chuck, can you do another mute all, please? Thank you. So first, documentation.
Se corta todo.
So first, documentation that verifies the number of full-time equivalent employees on payroll, as well as the dollar amounts of payroll costs, covered mortgage interest payments, covered rent payments, and covered utilities for the 8-week period following the loan will be provided to the lender. Okay, so that says you're going to have to provide some kind of documentation that says you did what your calculations said you were going to do. Now from the FAQ, it goes in a little more detail. The request will include documents that verify the number of full-time equivalent employees and pay rates, as well as the payments on eligible mortgage, lease, and utility obligations. You must certify that the documents are true and that you use the forgiveness amount to keep employees and make eligible mortgage interest, rent, and utility payments. A lender must make a decision on forgiveness of your loan within 60 days, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And now this final bit, which is fairly new, says you should consider submitting Form 941 and state quarterly wage unemployment insurance tax reporting forms or equivalent payroll processor records that best correspond to that covered period, that 8-week period, including evidence of any retirement and health insurance contributions. So there's 3 pieces there. Basically, this says after the 8 weeks, you will be submitting documentation to your lender that will cover these kinds of things. Now, there's not an official form that exists. There's not an official layout of this information that exists. At this point in time, the guides are just telling you, put together a package of information that adequately describes how you spent the money. So what's the lender's role? So you prepare this information, you send it to the lender. Now what's the lender do? Let's look at this in italics. Can lenders rely on borrower documentation for loan forgiveness? Yes. The lender does not need to conduct any verification if the borrower submits documentation supporting its request for loan forgiveness and attests that it has accurately verified the payments for eligible costs. It's a very important bullet. It doesn't say that the lender will not conduct the verification. It just says that they are not required to do it. Second bullet, the administrator, that's my boss, the administrator of the Small Business Administration, the administrator will hold harmless any lender that relies on such borrower documents and attestation from a borrower. All right, so we've established that the lender does not have to conduct verification and that we are going to hold them harmless from your documents. Third bullet, lender reliance on a borrower's required documents and attestation is necessary and appropriate in light of Section 1106H of the Act, that's the CARES Act, which prohibits the administrator from taking an enforcement action or imposing penalties if the lender has received borrower attestation. So this whole page says you are attesting to the accuracy and the completeness of the documentation you provide after the 8 weeks. The lender does not have to verify it. They may verify it, and I suspect most of the SBA lenders in this area will give a good close look to your documents. But even if they missed something, we aren't going to hold them liable for it. Instead, now let's talk about who is. Lenders must comply with the applicable lender obligations set forth in this interim final rule, but will be held harmless for borrowers' failure to comply with program criteria. Remedies for borrower violations and fraud are addressed separately. I also want to point out that in the CARES Act itself, the SBA was allocated an additional $25 million for what's called the Office of Inspector General. So that's a special part of the SBA. Those folks are law enforcement officers. They actually have badges and they carry weapons. and their jobs are to find folks that commit fraud with federal money and take appropriate action. So you should know then that you are completely liable for the documentation you submit for forgiveness of your PPP, and that there will be scrutiny at some point, some level, by SBA and other organizations. And very important here, there will be additional forgiveness issued by the SBA. Let's take a simple example. Before I do that, what we talked about earlier is that calculations that you make. Good grief. The calculations that you made in order to get your PPP loan, that's what you need to go do in order to get forgiveness of it. And it really shouldn't be much more complex than that. I realize that there are going to be lots of different factors to consider, but whatever you said to start, that's what we expect you to do. So let's take an example. My hypothetical company, I've figured that I have an average of 10 people that's full-time equivalent, and I got that from looking at the hours that my people work and adding in the number of full-time salaried people that I have on my staff. And then if I look at my 12 months of payroll, I add it all up, and I paid people $120,000 in the last year. So from that, I can take that $120,000, divide that by 12, and that would have told me that I had an average monthly payroll of $10,000. That $10,000 average monthly payroll, that gets multiplied by 2.5. This should look just like what everybody here did for their PPP loan. And so that would have got me a loan amount of $25,000. That $25,000 gets broken out. If you look at the blue here, out for payroll, 75% would be $18,750, and then for rent, mortgage, interest, and utilities is $6,250. So if these were your calculations when you applied for the loan, then that means you should be spending a minimum of $18,750 on applicable and permissible payroll costs. That leaves $6,250 that you could be spending for rent, mortgage, interest, and utilities. Now, what if you spend $20,000 on payroll? Well, and that means you would be spending $5,000 on the other thing. It doesn't say in the guidance, that is silent on that. It doesn't say that you can't spend more than $18,750. It only says you must spend at least $18,750, 75%. So in this very simple example, that's what you would want to be able to show at the end of 8 weeks, is that you spent $18,750 or more, and that the difference, in this case $6,250, you spent that on the appropriate rent, mortgage, interest, and utility. Now,
Tim,
yes.
let's pause for a second. We're having some difficulty with the muting. I was unable to unmute myself. I'm going to mute everyone. And if you're on the line, please mute yourself, or otherwise we're going to have to cancel this presentation.
Okay. And we mentioned earlier, but I know a lot of you got in maybe after we started, we're using a brand new tool for webinars doing this webinar, and it's a little persnickety, and we got to tweak a few settings and do a few other things. So bear with us. We'll get through this, and we're doing these every day at 9 o'clock. So Texas Citizens Bank is a SBA lender here in the Houston area. Now, we're not specifically saying here that we think Texas Citizens Bank is special or wonderful, or that there's anything about them that makes us want to refer to them, other than we know that they issued a document to their people that looks like this, to their lenders. And we thought it might be beneficial to share that with you. So they just have these three little groups of do's and don'ts. Say, do use the funds for payroll and authorized expenses only. Don't use the funds for unauthorized expenses. And then they go on to say, make sure you only pay for authorized expenses. You should expect to be audited by the bank or government officials. By avoiding misuse of the funds, your loan may be fully forgivable. And everybody here wants their loan to be fully forgivable. Whoops. Do be organized. I think this is a very good one. Keep records on how you use the loan funds. Opening and using a separate deposit account for the PPP loan funds can make this easy and streamline any auditing process. Don't mix loan funds with personal assets. Again, to keep things easy to track, avoid depositing your PPP loan funds into a personal account and avoid the temptation of using the funds to pay for personal expenses. And then finally, keep the rules in mind. Remember that PPP funds can only be used during the 8 weeks period. Well, let me say that a different way. I'm reading it wrong. Remember, your PPP funds need to be used immediately for authorized costs incurred during the 8 weeks immediately following the loan's origination. Kind of a complicated sentence. Also, at least 75% of the forgiven amounts must be used for payroll expenses during that time. Don't attempt to cheat. Now, I know nobody on this call would do that, but unscrupulous borrowers may try to take advantage of the law's gray areas. Please don't. The bank or representatives from the government are likely to perform an audit. The last thing you want is to be caught in an act of fraudulent use of funds. Now with that, that's basically everything about forgiveness. Like I mentioned earlier, it's really pretty simple. The calculations that you made and put on the loan application form to get your loan, now you need to go do those in order to achieve forgiveness. So let's look at some really common questions that we get on PPP forgiveness. We haven't yet had a staff reduction. Do we have to maintain staff through June 30th, or is it just for the 8-week period? Well, the guidance is silent on that. What it does say is you are only evaluated for forgiveness during those 8 weeks. So the answer should be, we're just looking at those 8 weeks. Before that and after that, we're not involved. Number 2, how soon do I have to rehire my employees? The guidance is silent on that. The expectation is that you keep people at work, and if you've laid them off, you bring them back as fast as you can. The whole point of the payroll protection program is to get payroll in the hands of workers. But we don't tell you how soon you have to do it. Number 3, do all employees need to return at the same time, or can some stay on unemployment for a while? Well, that's 2 questions. The first half, do employees need to return at the same time? The guidance is silent on that, so that's up to you. Can some stay on unemployment? Well, you need to talk to the Texas Workforce Commission about that. We're the federal government. We don't get involved in Texas government affairs. But if you are recalling employees from unemployment, then they should no longer be eligible for unemployment. Number 4, what if we have someone who doesn't come back until after the 8-week period? How do we include them? Well, again, you're only evaluated for the 8-week period following the PPP money being dispersed. So people that you hire after the 8-week period are not considered. Now some questions about using the funds. Number 1, can I include part-time employees in the forgiven wages? I hope everyone on the webinar is watching that go, well, yes, of course you can, because you can, yes. Remember, it's not full-time employees that are being considered, it's full-time equivalents. Number 2, can I pay all of the payroll to my employees as a lump sum at one time? I think that's an unusual thing, but the guidance is silent on that. We're not telling you how to pay your employees. We're just saying that you need to spend 75% or more on valid payroll expenses in order to achieve forgiveness. Number 3, can I pay any of my employees more than they normally make or work them for more hours than they normally work? The guidance is silent on that. We aren't telling you how much you pay your employees, and we aren't telling you how many hours to work them. We are saying that to get complete forgiveness, you need to spend 75% or more on valid payroll costs. You can't reduce their wages more than 25%, and you have to keep the same headcount. So other than that, you may do what you wish in paying your employees. Number 4, this is these are all real questions, by the way, that we've gotten from folks just like you. Number 4, let's say I receive $850,000 for the PPP. After 8 weeks, I've only used $600,000. So the balance, therefore, is $250,000. So will the $250,000 that I didn't use, will that turn into a loan at 1% for 2 years, or will I have to return it? Well, that's 2 questions. So the first question, will it turn into a loan? Yes. If you don't use all of the funds in that 8-week period, the balance will turn into a loan for 2 years at 1% interest. Can you return the $250,000? There's nothing in the guidance that I know of that says you have the option of returning it. You signed a promissory note with the bank. Whatever that promissory note says is what you have to do. So if the bank says you don't get to pay it all off at one time with $250,000, then you can't do it. If the bank says it's okay, then you can do it. The SBA is not involved in that promissory note. That's between you and the bank. So I think the real answer here is if you got a PPP for $850,000, then we want you to spend that so that 75% of it is on paychecks, and then you can be forgiven, with the other 25% being for the valid mortgage interest, rent, and utilities. But if you only spent $600, then that $250 will convert into a loan at 1% interest for a 2-year period. A couple more questions, and these are the last 2. If an employee chooses to stay on unemployment, let's stop there. Now remember, again, I'm not a lawyer and I don't work for the state of Texas or the Texas Workforce Commission, but employees don't get to choose to stay on unemployment. If you recall them to work and they don't come back to work, then I think that means they lose their unemployment privilege at that point, because a job is now available. Unemployment isn't an alternative job. It's only for when you can't get a job. So, but I don't work for Texas Workforce Commission, and I'm going to have to leave that to you to understand how unemployment works. If you need help on that, by the way, you can certainly reach out to any of our partner organizations with the SBA. Isn't that the next slide, Chuck? Yeah, it is. So we will show you who those people are, and they can answer all the questions you have on unemployment. So if an employee chooses not to stay in unemployment, we address that, or not come back at all, do I just send their portion back to the bank, or can I disperse their portion to the rest of the employees? The guidance is silent on that. Again, if you can just send money back to the bank, that'll be up to your deal with the bank, the promissory note that you signed. Can you disperse the portion to the rest of your employees? The guidance is silent on that. We don't tell you how to spend the money, other than 75% or more needs to be for valid payroll costs. The only problem I see here is you may have a lower head count. So if you have an employee that isn't coming back for whatever reason, then that should mean that your employee head count will be lower. If your head count is lower, then you're not going to get 100% forgiveness. So I think the right answer to this question is hire somebody else. If you hire somebody else, then you keep your head count up, and then you have somebody to spend that money on. So there's lots of possible answers to this number 1. You can have a lower head count and spread that money out across all of them, but then you're not going to get full forgiveness because you didn't keep up your head count. Or you can hire somebody new and pay them what you would have paid the other person. So there's various ways that this could be approached, always keeping in mind that we need 75% or more to be spent on valid payroll costs, And then whatever is left over will be spent on mortgage interest, rent, or utilities, keeping in mind those dates that I gave you before as well. Then number two, this gets into, for those of you that are into accounting, whether you're doing cash versus accrual method of accounting. We process payroll the day that we receive the loan. The paychecks include the week before disbursement of the loan. Are those payments for the week before eligible for forgiveness, even though we were paying staff wages accrued during the prior week? I'm going to refer you to your accountant. The guidance is silent on this, and the SBA doesn't give specific accounting advice. Now, our partners will, and I'll show you who those are here in a minute. I think the simplest approach is what happens within the 8 weeks is what you get to count. But you're going to have to decide if, with your accountant, what the right response is. For instance, if you always do accrual accounting in your business, then an accrual accounting approach to forgiveness may make the most sense. If you do a cash accounting kind of approach, a lot of sole proprietors do that, then that's probably the right answer. In both cases, I think that you would want to talk to your accountant. If you don't have an accountant, then talk to one of our counselors and let them help you out. They will be able to help you with that question. And then there's a few assorted ones. Number one, you all know the answer to this already. What documents do I submit to properly document forgiveness? Well, we mentioned earlier, then probably your 941s. If you are paying for some various employee benefits, then perhaps copies of those bills that show that you paid them in full with a canceled check or with an entry off of a bank account statement that shows they were paid. For the actual pay itself, perhaps your payroll register, or if you use a payroll processor, then you should be getting statements from them. So you want this to be detailed. If you have 10 employees, then in my opinion, not the SBA's opinion, you want to show every employee and what they're paying them and how all that adds up to allow forgiveness. As I mentioned earlier, there's not a form or an official method of this reporting. You need to report it in whatever way that completely covers the subject. Number two, how will an FTE be calculated? Now, I'm not going to go into that here. That's also something you should work out with your accountant. If you don't have an accountant, then you should talk to one of our partners. But the real answer to this question is you should have already calculated FTE because you've already applied for a loan. Now, if you are one of those that have not applied for PPP and you think you're going to do it, I would urge you the second this webinar is over, go get it done, because PPP is getting pretty close to the second round of money being consumed. So if you have not applied, you'd better do it quick or you may not get a chance. So the real answer here to how will FTE be calculated, well, it's however you calculated it when you applied for the loan. Use the same calculations you used in the front on the back. In a lot of industries, they use a 30-hour week as a full-time example. Other industries use a 40-hour week. Whatever is appropriate for you and whatever you used when you got the application approved, use that same calculation on the end when you're requesting forgiveness. Number three, I own two companies. One, and this is the one that received PPP funds, rents the property from the other company under contract. Since these entities have common ownership, will the rent payment from one to the other be allowed? Well, the guidance is silent on who you pay your rent to. It just says you have to have had a rent agreement in place by February 15, 2020. Since you have a rent agreement in place, it would seem that you'd be fine. Again, the guidance does not address this specific situation. It only says that you had to have a rent agreement in place as of February 15, 2020. Number four, this one may apply to a bunch of you on this call. I'm a sole proprietor and included my earnings on the wages as allowed by SBA. I am not part of the normal payroll. Instead, I calculate earnings at the end of the month after all expenses. How do I document my distributions to myself so they will be forgiven? Well, the guidance is silent on how you document distributions to a sole proprietor. I think to help you, I would say, what would you do for the Internal Revenue Service? How do you tell the Internal Revenue Service that you pay yourself? Or, in very practical terms, talk with your accountant, or maybe talk with one of our counselors, and I'll show them to you here in just a minute. In a lot of cases, for instance, when I ran my business as a sole proprietor, I would pay myself out of my commercial checking account into my personal checking account, and I did that electronically. So I could easily produce a statement for one account and a statement for the other account and show the disbursements that I made from my commercial account to my personal account. That would be pretty easy. If you actually write a check, then those canceled checks you wrote to yourself out of your commercial account. Now, I've talked about these resource partners. These folks are available to help you. Between them, there's probably around 250 people in Southeast Texas, most of them clustered around the Houston metro. The Texas Gulf Coast Small Business Development Center, you can see their phone number and their email, website address right there. And they also are doing a number of webinars every day to help small businesses through this economic disaster. The WBEA Women's Business Center, and then the Houston SCORE organization. Between these three, as I say, there's about 250 counselors and mentors available to help you at no charge. You just call those numbers or hit those websites and you will be able to request someone to help you. They're going to connect with you via Skype or Zoom or something like that. They aren't holding office hours that I know of until COVID is more under control, but they are available and they can help you. And then don't forget to smile. Forgiveness shouldn't be all that hard to get. I think what we covered here is that essentially the calculations that allowed you to get your PPP loan, comply with those in the documentation for forgiveness, and you should be able to achieve forgiveness. With that, thank you very much for your time. We hope that your businesses get full forgiveness. We hope that you get through this COVID disaster easily and well, and that your families all remain healthy. Thank you very much for your time.